session. And this session is such that it is not so deep techy, but it's so African. I don't know if that makes English sense, but yeah, we're deviating from deep tech in a way, and we're talking about culture in Africa. And to lead the session is Zak El Fassi, who is the founder of Zaygood Labs. And the title of the session is Beyond Deep Tech, an exploration at the frontiers of reality, exploring how the stories we tell ourselves influence innovation, drive collective behavior, and define Africa's role in the global tech landscape. Discover how defining these narratives can unlock unprecedented opportunities, empowering Africa to lead the deep tech revolution and create a prosperous, sustainable future. Over to you, Zak.
Thank you, Fumi, and thank you everyone for well, it wasn't a conversation. It's a meta conversation about deep tech and a thread that I'm glad we managed to somewhat pull, because it's very, very I wouldn't say hard, but it's not trivial to talk about deep tech in African context. Because for the longest time, I thought that I was contrarian, like talking about deep tech and frontier topics, and typically I wouldn't talk about them publicly. And one day, Emeka and I were chatting, and the Africa deep tech came up, and I was like, well, yeah, I mean, might as well just like grab a bunch of misfits that all think very outside the box and see what can happen. Little did I know that part of my identity of being contrarian would be dissolved, right? And so, like, for someone that's always been about, oh, I'm gonna prove you wrong, or I'm gonna like do the innovation the different way. I got to a point with Africa Deep Tech Foundation, or the community, and over the past 2 years, where I realized that I can no longer be contrarian, and I have to exit the contrarian mode, because I think it's time to build ideas slightly differently. And I think today's conversations were all centered around that. This is going to be slightly different. This is going to be, it doesn't have a name, but let's see where we can get it. So if you've spent any time on YouTube, and let's be honest, everyone does. For me, it's typically around food time. You're familiar with this. This is a metaphorical approach to showcasing complexity and showcasing depth. And so, like, typically these deep dive or iceberg deep dives go from super shallow to super deep topics. If you're interested or have time or bandwidth, there's like this 200 plus playlist you can check out, all about iceberg deep dives. Why am I talking about icebergs? Because when I looked at this playlist, there was no deep dive for deep tech or frontier tech in an African context. And that got me thinking, what are we missing here? What are we missing individually and collectively? Because even if, let's say, go to GPT and try to generate something like this, you might get stuck, because there isn't that much information, there isn't that much coherence in how we tell the narrative. And this is somewhat like what I'm gonna be talking about here. So I was planning this talk, and it started a bit early, because for once I was like, all right, I'm gonna actually like prep this talk properly, and it took as much time as if I had started it this morning. But I kept thinking throughout the whole time, the iceberg metaphor doesn't resonate. It just does not make sense. Oh, someone just told me that you can't see my slides. Oh, that's a bummer. Sorry. Oh, let's fix that. By the way, this is funny, because I was taking care of the slides before, or the hidden tech part of this conference, and obviously, like, things have to fail when it's your turn. But let's fix that quick. This is in the spirit of fail fast. All right. Okay. Let's hope that it works now. Let's see.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, when you're presenting, you realize actually the difference between being a host or a moderator and a presenter, and the presenter experience on Zoom webinar is not amazing. So I hope there's an African startup trying to fix this. Okay, icebergs do not resonate. And so I'm super lazy. That's why I'm an engineer. And I don't try to venture super far or spend so much energy looking for ideas. I try to, bring ideas back home whenever possible, and try to find something that resonates with this metaphor, but in African context. So this is an experiment that I've done with Grok, XAI, or Elon Musk's AI, and asked it to analyze my X profile. It's like my X profile has a bunch of buzzwords: engineer, philosopher, yada yada, past history, and what I do currently. a bunch of buzzwords, and my Twitter feed is full of very, very random topics and very obscure things. And I still was like, well, okay, Grok is the first AI that actually has access to the real-time corpus of what a person is creating. So it might be interesting to actually see what Grok knows about me. So Grok came back with this, which was super spot on, deep reflective philosophical musings, identity in digital age. And so you could basically just scan this, and this is what I've been spending the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years on, from different angles, but mostly an angle that is very, very unseen in technology conversations today. And that's kind of like a techno-philosophical angle that takes into account not just what we're doing today, where we're going, but also past history. I'm not talking about past history, World War II. I'm talking about past history, where we came from. And that's where it gets tricky, because we don't know. And it gets tricky, but also it gets fascinating because we don't know, which means that there is a lot of work still to be done to be able to know. And obviously, like when I figured that Grok knows this much about me, I blocked Elon Musk because the guy just knows too much. And so, who owns our narratives in this AI-mediated world? Like, if you look at this presentation, a bunch of it is AI generated, right? The introduction, I don't know if the introduction was AI generated or not, but parts of it were AI generated. If not AI generated, it was corrected by AI. If not corrected by AI, it was suggested by AI, or like some attribute of this talk originated in some AI interaction, which is kind of to say, like, it originated in computer interaction. I was in high school when it's a very random story that I'm just thinking about it now. There was this biology teacher that asked us to, bring a report back, and I brought back a typed printed report, and she laughed at me in front of everybody. And I feel like the same pattern is happening now with AI, because if you use AI to generate text or generate images, yeah, you might have people that support it, but most people are like, this sounds like AI, or this is AI. I think this is a blip in the system. This is how evolution happens. People first get used to technology from their own perspective and their own mental models, and then they extrapolate how they can find it useful. And then, like 10 years later, you find it that it's permeating every single thing. Except with AI or generative AI, it's not 10 years later. I use Apple's Mac OS, and there's already a very, very good embedded on-device AI or large language model integration that does a bunch of things right. Anyhow, so Grok knows a bunch about me, and then I was like, you know what? Let's actually play with this and figure out an upside down what the upside down narrative looks like. Because if Grok tells my narrative, I want to figure out how to own back the narrative. And so Fumi responded, this again, like how we bring the narrative back to the human aspect is by involving others. Because yeah, like this whole thing might be AI generated, but the parts that were influenced by humans are the important parts. And so that's basically the focus of this whole thing. And so I asked Grok to flip it upside down, and it said these things. Someone that lives in the moment, embraces materialism in a minimalistic way, and shuns for the deep and delightfully shallow. And the inverted version mentions living, these things, and it basically describes cool. Like a person that's cool, which is, sometimes I am, but most times I'm not, especially on the internet. And when I saw that, I remembered a conversation that I've had with a friend of mine, Ronnie Pontiac, where he was talking about where the concept of cool originated from. The American cool, that like basically now it's global culture, and it originated in this Yoruba concept, itutu. And so basically Grok was like, hey, how about you like basically become a bit more itutu? And so this talk, it has already started, but it already hasn't started. It's a meta narrative in how the stories and the words and the things that we tell ourselves and the things that we hear from others, including AI, shape our words in ways that typically we do not realize until much later. And so there was in December there was this podcast that showed up out of nowhere. It's called the Telepathy Tapes. And so this was a single journalist kind of production that went super viral because it tapped into something very, very deep in human psychology, which is, telepathy, like reading minds. And so if you're interested in, breaking your brain, go give this podcast a listen, because it might actually expose you to a different way of the workings of the world that you might not be familiar with. And this is basically what this talk is about. I'm hoping to, well, it's not going to be talking about telepathy, not yet, but I'm hoping to drive home some points that some people might find interesting, some people might find interesting to dive deeper on, and that would, that would help you see some things. So if not iceberg, then what? Well, look around us. Well, not us here in California. We don't have sand dunes, but we do have sand dunes all over Africa. north, south, west, east. And so desert dune is basically an iceberg made of sand. It has layers, it has depth, and it has a lot of mystery. But unlike an iceberg, it's built by a lot of wind and a lot of time, generational time. And it's shaped by the very forces that threaten to destroy it. And so this metaphor kind of like resonated even more than icebergs and got me super excited to actually work on this talk. And so I designed this African deep tech dune. I call it the DTD. For developers in the audience, there's a joke there. And it has 5 layers. I'm going to go over them well, somewhat briefly. Each one represents different depth of African innovation and wisdom. And yes, I'm fully aware by creating another framework, this creates another narrative and kind of like participating in the thing that I'm trying to deconstruct, but at least like I'm giving you a spoiler, well, not spoiler, but giving you a heads up. This is meant to influence. And so sometimes you need to use the available tools to rebuild pyramids. So let's see how to do that. At the very surface layer, you have things like Afrofuturism. You have the tourist-centric culture that we're very, very familiar with. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it barely scratches the surface of what Africa is. And so, even flashy fintech apps and all of that, it's very interesting. But the surface layer also has a lot of depth than most people realize. Like, for example, design languages are super important. I explicitly, for Africa deep tech, you probably see a lot of gradients and a lot of vibrant colors because that's what African landscape looks like. Yes, it doesn't exist anywhere else on the web, but they're lost. And so basically starting from the ground up is also like looking at even like the surface and figuring out how to polish it using things that are familiar, things that are environmental. I think it was Alex earlier that mentioned the brain is lazy. Like 100%, the brain is lazy, but also efficient. And part of that efficiency is finding ideas and that are close to us. And so every African startup, or every time an African startup chooses to build for local needs first, that's an act of narrative reclamation, at least at the surface level. Going back to the next layer, which is shifting sands. So this is the trick part. When you look at the sand dune, the trick part is the second layer, because this is where mainstream narratives try to define us. The one Africa's rising, the next frontier, tech saves Africa. We're all aware of that. But it's also where we start pushing back, if we can, if we want. And so when Africa deep tech initially started, it was more like how can we? It wasn't about creating possibility, but it was about allowing space for that possibility to emerge. And it's a form of decolonizing the space of ideas. If there are ideas that feel out of reach, then we'd have to ask ourselves, why do they feel out of reach? And as someone mentioned earlier, in the AI age and generative AI age and ChatGPT age, there is absolutely no reason for anybody to say, like, I don't know, or I can't search. And so I'm not saying like that replaces actual research, but that makes research accessible. One of the videos during the, I think, first break was Omojo Miller, who was talking about accessing computer first time was an act of accessing information in a freely and available way, and that kind of resonates. Because this is what AI and large language models are offering us, but at 100x speed and much more, more available, cheaper. Yeah, there are risk and compromise and whatnot, but that's a whole conversation for another time. All right, let's like one example of such things is geopolitical distortions, which is specifically the Mercator projection that shows Africa in a lens that is not real. It's not a conspiracy. It was done because at that time there were well, it was the easiest way to connect ports and do maritime navigation back in the olden days. And somehow we're still stuck in that narrative. And so like if you see the right side and left side, the left side image is fairly recent. And it shows you the actual true sense of how big the world is relative to each other. And how actual small countries have a lot of influence because the narrative that they've seen. It's not about narrative that they've told themselves. The narrative actually that people have been born with is like, oh, look at us, we're the center of the world. We're like huge country, big country. And that defines people. It defines how people think. And so we're getting slightly deeper, and you start to see a pattern here. The deeper we go, the more fundamental things become. And so the next layer is about building identity. This is the structural foundation. This is the the data centers of us. You can see here, well, I mentioned Itutu at the very beginning. You can see Ubuntu, for example. Ubuntu, I am because we are. And this is, well, I spoiled it for me. This is the Ubuntu logo. And it's not super far, but Ubuntu actually has African origins, not because of the name, but the founder. The founder is originally South African. And so you can see actually how this concept influenced the entirety of the world, because the evolution of technology is also the evolution of Unix systems, and the evolution of Unix systems got accelerated massively by the Ubuntu community over the past 20 years or so. Actually, yeah, 21 years this year. And so this is something that is fundamentally changing the world with African origins, but I haven't actually heard the stories being told. And so again, like if we look back here, you'll find oratory culture. And this is something that I grew up in, well, I was born and raised in Morocco. And oratory culture is part of culture, like reading and writing is not that, or at least at that time wasn't that super common. It was more like about storytelling. And later on, I realized actually that's a common thing across the continent. And I was like, okay, well, obviously the internet today, this was 2013. The internet today does not serve us because most of African languages are not written languages. Like even Moroccan Darija is not written. Like you can write it, but it's a whole headache. And so I'm like, okay, well, there is a need, and that need became this product, Talk and Comment. Well, somewhat defunct, whole different story. I gave a talk about it actually at one of the private sessions at Africa Deep Tech. And the product started from this idea of something is missing that culturally was interesting for us. And no one seems to be solving it. So I'm like, okay, well, let's figure out how to solve it quick. And basically built a layer on top of any web page that can, well, you can add a voice layer on top of any web page. The product went through a bunch of transformation, got stalled, and it was an experiment from day one in this, being contrarian. Like, how can you push the boundary by doing something different, but also something that's much closer to where most people look. Diving a bit deeper, almost done. This is the wisdom layer. This is, when the therapy tapes hit the numbers one on Spotify and all podcast lists in December, January. Everyone was shocked by the idea that consciousness might work differently than we thought. And, like African cultures, we've been exploring local consciousness for millennia, maybe more. And so like our traditional healers understood the body as an information processing system long before we had computers. And so what if, stay with me here, our ancestors actually had a better understanding of what consciousness is than we do today. And their understanding was that it is not primitive, but preliminary to everything else. See, like we're getting super deep here. But this is the root base. At the root base, there is a fabric of reality. Like this is our firmware. This is how we render everything that we see, everything that we interact with, everything that makes us who we are. And so down here at the base, we found concept that might just reshape computing if taken seriously, such as African time is not linear. It's relational, it's event-based, it's cyclical, like all these things that we have been told generationally, either through proverbs, either through family stories, either through religion. All those stories are basically what this firmware is. And our narrative of that is somewhat different. Because like if I tell you here at the very base that time is not linear, it's relational, event-based, and cyclical, at the very top, you have one global perception, which is African time. And it's not a global perception. It's a perception. It's a global perception that became an owned perception. Basically, we're like, yeah, it's going to be like half an hour late because African time. And so like borrowing this narrative that is, it's not true or false. It's just a narrative. Just means that we haven't yet understood exactly how we process time. And so imagine temporal computing built on that model. And so our traditional societies operated as distributed networks long before blockchain made it cool. And if we dig deeper into these concepts, again, I promise I'm not going to dive into each one of them because this is going to be like each one is a half an hour conversation. You'll find some very interesting, fascinating, beyond deep tech technologies. And so like that's what I call frontier technology because it's still at the frontier. Nobody has dared to explore it, or at least like nobody has dared to publicly explore it. So maybe it's time to start doing some of that. And so this is where the metaphor comes together. For icebergs, I knew that octopus, they can live in super deep sea, like even like the deepest holes in the ocean, and can come up to the top to do things. And I realized that actually we have the same thing, desert beetle. And so the desert beetle spends a lot of time hiding, preserved by dunes, like pyramids, and climbs up to the top to fog harvest, right? And so this fog harvesting idea is it's almost like existential to how I see deep tech in Africa. It is something like you climb dune each morning, you extract life from seemingly empty air, and everybody's like, what the hell is this beetle doing? And you keep doing it on and on and on and on. until one day I realized, oh, only beetles are here. Because they've figured out a way to work better as a society, because they have very different environment, and they came up with different solutions, but to the same innovation, which is how can you climb from the deepest depth to the top and then come back again without losing sight of who you are. And so this is not about being better or worse, dune versus iceberg. It's really about how we authentically adapt to our environments and how we channel that into products, societies, things that we build to shape the world. And so remember how we started. Grok analyzed my profile, that service narrative. We've gone super deep. I don't have Zoom in front of me. Don't know if there are any questions or not, because I wanted to be respectful of everyone's time, and especially our financiers coming up next. And so through the shift in sand of this AI-mediated identity thing, we can notice that when we change the base layer, our fundamental stories and metaphors, everything above it transforms. And so this talk, like all good journeys, is really just beginning in exploring this non-iceberg, this dune here, and I'm looking forward to see how we collectively climb up. And I think the future of technology is not really binary; it's really as varied as the landscapes where we come from. So this was it until I closed my laptop last night, and I kept thinking about this very somewhat weird esoteric video that I made sometime in August, and so like it kept nagging at me. And so I posted. It was just a live session. I was like, all right, I have this idea. It's like crazy idea, which is like I want to map civilizations throughout history, a time axis on X and a prosperity axis Y. Prosperity, innovation, cultural impact across time, and Africa was almost nowhere to be seen. Alex earlier mentioned Mansa Musa and a few. I called them. What do I call them here? Lost civilizations of Africa, and I believe that there are way more, because if I'll share with you this project, GitHub, whatever it's going to end up with later. But it's this idea that if something is not represented, it doesn't necessarily mean it has never been there. It might have just been hiding or getting preserved. Thank you.